Good morning, everyone, and hi, Desiree. The water has arrived. Yes. Look, we have really a wonderful, fascinating day of presentations, and I want to jump into those, get started as quickly as we can, and we have a lot of experience and scholarship in the room here. My name is Will Milberg. I'm the dean here at the New School for Social Research, and very proud to be one of three institutions co-sponsoring this event, along with the Leo Baeck Institute, where we convened last night, and the German Historical Institute. And I want to thank, first of all, my collaborators in this, organizing this, Billy Weitzer at Leo Baeck and Simona Lessig at German Historical Institute. As we did last night, we also want to thank our donors from the DFG. We have a number of them even visiting us from Germany today, so we're very pleased to have them here. And we've had support from DAAD and others, and we're really, the New School, the Leo Baeck Institute, German Historical Institute have all provided both financial support, administrative support, and we're just thrilled that after a lot of thinking, we're finally here. What that thinking entailed, and in some respects it comes to a head, as Judith Friedlander just pointed out to me in today's newspaper, which is the Supreme Court of the United States ruling that the travel ban, in fact, can go into effect. And so the U.S. has now imposed a ban on visas, incoming immigration from 6 countries, I guess 7 countries, and it's serious in itself, but it also represents, of course, a kind of not only a move in the United States, but a move globally to a kind of backlash against a wave of refugees and immigrants, and in our case, potential scholars. And as we learned last night in the really wonderful keynote, very far-ranging and with lots of examples from Germany in the 1930s to Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, all the way to Princeton University and refugee camps today. What we learned is that institutions matter. And that is the main focus that we wanted to take in this conference. We wanted not to focus, as so much of the literature does, and it did appropriately, on heroic individuals who escaped or who saved others. We wanted to look more sociologically, more historically, more culturally at the university role, the foundation role, the role of governments, and we started to hear some real detail about that last night in the keynote address, and I think we're going to hear just a lot of very deep scholarship on that issue today. So I really look forward to today's conference. I welcome you to the New School and the New School for Social Research. Please help yourself to coffee and snacks over there, and let's have a great day of presentations and discussion. Before we jump into the panel, I just want to ask Simona Lessig from the German Historical Institute to say a word. Simona.
Yeah, thank you, Will, and good morning to everyone. For the German Historical Institute, this conference represents an opportunity to collaborate with 2 distinguished academic institutions, as well as an opportunity to revisit a topic of great importance to the GHI. The very first conference, I think it's 30 years ago, the GHI organized was on German-speaking refugee historians. And that conference explored not only the impact of refugees on the study of history here in the United States, but also the important role that refugees played in the rebuilding of the German historical profession after 1945. And not least, they helped initiate a transatlantic dialogue among historians that the GHI is working to keep alive. We took up this interest in refugee academics, and especially in the institutions that helped refugee academics again in December 2015. Against the background of the increasing number of refugees from Syria, the GHI and Germany's Association of Historians organized a one-day symposium at the American Academy in Berlin. And this symposium did focus on the challenges of integrating refugee scholars. That symposium was actually one route for this conference today, and it highlighted an important dimension of the GHI's mission. We firmly believe that history can and should be a part of public discussion of contemporary issues. History might not reveal itself, and it might not offer practical solutions to the problems of the present. But historical analysis can sharpen and refine our thinking about the challenges our societies face. And one challenge was just mentioned by Will. Historical analysis is an invitation to critical reflection on the possibilities of action open to us, or for action open to us. There is unfortunately no reason to think that threats to scientists and scholars would go away anytime soon. And we, as scholars in the West, need to ask what we might do to help our colleagues at risk more efficiently and effectively. On behalf of the GHI, I want to thank our partners in the project, my co-conveners, Wilma Work and Willy Weitzer, and the New School and the Leo Baeck Institute, and all the institutions and individuals that provide funding for this conference. Special thanks goes to Dr. Henry Kaufmann and to the German Research Foundation, the DFG as it is commonly called. The DFG has demonstrated genuine interest in this conference right from the start, and it has now demonstrated its interest by sending not only a very generous financial contribution, but also 3 representatives from Germany. And so a very warm welcome to the Vice President of the DFG, Julika Grimm. She will give a presentation over lunch. To Guido Lammers, the Program Officer for History, and to Rainer Krulich, the new head, or not so new now, of the North American office of the DFG. And I would also like to thank those people who did the legwork in preparing this conference, especially to Sally Dill at the GHI in Washington. She could not be here today, but I'm sure some of you know her name by now, and to Desiree Lavecchia, who did the same here at the New School. And last but not least, I would like to thank all of you, the participants in the conference. After reading all the papers, I'm sure that we will have a very interesting discussion, and I'm looking forward to your presentations. Thank you very much.
Well, then, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Stefan Rinke from Freie Universität Berlin, Latin American Institute. I'm very happy and flattered to be here. I thank the organizers for the invitation, and it is my task to moderate the first panel. And on the panel, and I invite all the 3 speakers to come along and sit here. On our panel, we have today Professor Judith Friedlander, and then after that, Professor Ludger Pries and Daniela Gleiser. So let me quickly introduce our 3 talkers, presenters. And before I do, let me just mention that I do think that this is, as we already heard, a very timely issue, and one that has accompanied us for so many decades, as Professor Lessig just pointed out. Actually, my very first academic publication in 1990, when I was still a graduate student here in the US, was on a refugee scholar, Alfred Wagtz, who came here to the United States and was the son-in-law of Charles Beard. And so I was especially happy and grateful that the conference on this issue is going to happen. And we have, I think, here 3 fantastic speakers with very brand new research. And the first to introduce is Professor Judith Friedlander. Of course, almost everybody here in the room will know her because she's a Professor Emerita of Anthropology and a long-standing member of the Hunter College community, and she served as Dean of Social Science here before Bill came in. And she was Dean here for 7 years and has a strong record of historical commitment to human rights and policy research, and has established 2 new policy centers, the International Center for Migration, Ethnicity and Citizenship, and the Center for Economic Policy and transforming the East and Central Europe program into the Trans-Regional Center for the Study of Democracy. Of course, Professor Friedlander has written extensively. She has published very many books, some of which, being Indian in Huyapan, a study of indigenous Latin American life and culture in Mexico, are, of course, classics also in my field of Latin American studies. So we all read your books in Berlin, Professor Friedlander. But she's not just a Latin Americanist, which I think is already quite a bit, but she also published on Jewish intellectuals in France and has a very strong commitment also to France. Let me now quickly introduce Professor Ludger Pries. On the other side, on the German side, also somebody that for a German public I wouldn't have to introduce at all because he's such an outstanding scholar and social scientist. He started actually in Mexico with the chair Pierre Naville at Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana and has been since 2001 full professor at Ruhr-Universität Bochum. His research interests include migration, transnationalization, the sociology of work and organization, research on biographies, comparative sociology. He has taught and done research in Brazil, Mexico, Spain, and the US. And quite until very recently, he held the Wilhelm and Alexander von Humboldt Chair at El Colegio de Mexico, and he has just very recently returned to Bochum. There are very, very many publications that he has written, perhaps also who speak a lot to the topic of our conference. One of them is quite recently at Campus Press, Migration und Ankommen, Migration and Arrival. Thank you very much. Migration and Arrival, the chances of the refugee movement. And then many other books about transnationalization and a social scientist really with a perspective on Latin America. And for you here in the US, that might be shocking, but in Germany, that is still something very special because there are not too many social scientists who really look beyond the first world into what is going on in other parts of the world. And let me thirdly, last not least, introduce to you my dear colleague, Professor Daniela Gleiser-Salzman, who in the Mexican context would be somebody not even necessary to introduce because she's so well known there. And she has her license in history from UNAM, the best university in Latin America. And her maestria is her master's degree at Colegio de Mexico, the other best university of Latin America. They are two very, very on a par. Colegio de Mexico does not have all the faculties, so it's not included in the rankings. But I would say for subjects such as history, it is the leading one. And she has a doctorate in history from El Colegio de Mexico too, and with a book that is very, very important. It has just 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, been published in the English version, and that is I don't have the English title here, so help me out, Daniela.
Unwelcome Exiles.
Unwelcome Exiles, exactly. It's about Jewish exiles in Mexico and the way Mexico treated the refugees, refugee scholars, but not just refugee scholars, refugees from totalitarian Germany in that moment. She is now professor at UNAM, at the Institute of Historical Investigations, and her research interests include the Mexican politics of naturalization in the 20th century. So what do you need to become a Mexican? You know, how do you get a Mexican nationality? And then a second one, which is of course her long-standing interest, the topic of exile and refugees in Mexico in the 20th century. She has gained very many prizes for her work. She's really an outstanding scholar, and I might say that I myself am very happy to be able to moderate here what seems to be a perfect fit of scholars from 3 different regions reflecting on a common topic. But I also have to remind you of my Prussian heritage, and you only have 20 minutes each, and I shall be very strict, as my colleague reminded me to be, and so that we can still have time left for questions and answers. So a warm welcome to the 3 speakers. And then we'll start right away with Professor Friedlander's talk.
May we sit at the table, or would you like us to get up? Can everybody see me?
Oh,
right.
As you like it. I mean,
all right.
Really.
Why not? Why not?
Okay.
All right. We'll all have our regional qualities. I'm a New Yorker. I speak quickly. Please slow me down if you can't follow me, and I will, if you'll permit me, read so that I keep to my limit. Mm-hmm. Jeremy Edelman raised some challenging questions last night for the scholar rescue movement. Some of them, I assume, will be addressed during the round table this afternoon. Let me begin by picking up on Edelman's response to a member of the audience about the ethical dilemma academic institutions face by essentially limiting our efforts to help persecuted scholars only, as we bear witness to the plight of 70 million people who have had to flee for their lives in recent years, only 1% of whom, Edelman added poignantly, have a college education. At best, we are making a symbolic gesture when we save a handful of scholars from targeted academic institutions, and even this modest gesture leads us into making painful, not to say morally compromising, choices between one persecuted professor and another. The Scholar Rescue Fund and Scholars at Risk make heart-rending decisions of this kind almost every day. So did the director of the New School, Alvin Johnson, after he boldly stepped forward in April 1933 and created the legendary University in Exile, offering refuge to social scientists in Nazi Germany. Moving beyond the original idea, by the time the Second World War ended in 1945, Johnson had provided teaching positions for nearly 200 scholars and artists and life-saving visas, not only for them, but also for their wives and children. An extraordinary achievement, but the selection process was excruciating, forcing Johnson to turn thousands of people away. As the head of an academic institution, Johnson only appointed scholars who were making significant contributions to their fields. A candidate had to prove as well that he held a teaching or research position in Germany or an occupied country within the last 2 years before the mass dismissals began. Age, too, was a factor. Although exceptions were made, a candidate was not supposed to be older than 55. Then there were the visa restrictions. The U.S. government only recognized spouses and dependent children on the refugee scholar's visa, but nobody else, not an older son or daughter, not an aging parent. When Johnson decided to open a university in exile, he moved with astonishing speed, announcing his intentions on April 24, 1933, only 17 days after the Nazis began expelling scholars from German universities who had failed to meet the new racial and political criteria spelled out in the Civil Service Restoration Act. Having moved so quickly, Johnson got out ahead of the Rockefeller Foundation and the Institute of International Education, IIE, and they were not happy about it. In the end, the 3 worked closely together, not because they shared a common vision about how to address the refugee problem, but because the leaders of other academic institutions were not enthusiastic about welcoming to their campuses refugee scholars of Jewish origin, even if Rockefeller and IIE were sponsoring them. Johnson, on the other hand, was happy to do so. But in Johnson's grand scheme of things, American universities should do more than rescue individual professors, as critical as that was. They also should try to preserve the very institution that gave rise to German scholarship. Quote, "The university itself," he proclaimed, "was being exiled." At stake was the future of European civilization. No piecemeal solution would do. The refugee scholars needed to stay together in special facilities, created for them alone, as Johnson planned to do, and hoped other institutions would follow. If American universities only opened their doors to one or two scholars, the way Rockefeller and IIE wanted them to do, the great humanistic traditions of Europe would disappear. But that was not Johnson's only motivation. The new school, he explained, needed a graduate faculty to deepen the intellectual experiences of adult students in its continuing education program. These students included lawyers, bankers, and businessmen who, Johnson continued, wanted to understand the theories behind legal systems, finance, and market economies, and to learn how to do serious empirical research. These men had something important to say, but they did not know how to say it, he said. To achieve its true and vital purpose, the new school needed a graduate faculty. Given the institution's chronic financial problems, it could not possibly raise the money it needed. Now, however, a tragedy like the one facing Germany made it possible for Johnson to raise the necessary funds to recruit an outstanding faculty in the social sciences, while also championing a cause he cared deeply about, a cause that spoke directly as well to the founding principles of the new school. Johnson, an economist and journalist, was one of the founders in 1919 of the New School for Social Research, along with other prominent intellectuals and philanthropists of the day, including historians Charles Beard and James Harvey Robinson, and the editor-in-chief of the New Republic, Herbert Croly. Champions of academic freedom, the group founded the New School as an act of protest against universities across the universities, whose policies, they claimed, interfered with the rights of professors to express themselves freely. The group's primary target was Columbia University and its president, Nicholas Murray Butler, who had fired 2 members of the faculty for speaking out as pacifists during World War I, while American soldiers were fighting overseas. Several years later, Beard, Croly, and Robinson walked away from the experiment in higher education, leaving the new school in the hands of Alvin Johnson. Now, in April 1933, this same Alvin Johnson decided to open a university in exile. Classes began the following October, taught exclusively by refugee scholars who had fled Nazi Germany only weeks before. What Johnson accomplished in less than 6 months would have been extraordinary during the best of times, but he pulled it off in the depths of the Great Depression at an academic institution burdened with debts. It took Johnson less than a month to raise enough money to launch the rescue campaign and to persuade the American government to issue special visas to the exiled professors and their families. He accomplished all of this, moreover, at a time when the country had closed its doors to immigrants and was turning refugees away, while its universities routinely restricted the number of Jews they accepted as students and members of the faculty. The speed with which Johnson acted in 1933, despite the incredible odds, demonstrates what an academic leader with conviction can do when circumstances demand it. May he serve as a model to university presidents today as they first face a world crisis of similar magnitude that threatens once again to speak like Johnson, the life of democracy and civilization itself. The founding faculty in October 1933 consisted of 10 social scientists, all of whom had lost their jobs the previous April. Known as the Mayflower Professors, there were 6 economists, 1 legal theorist, 1 musicologist, 1 psychologist, and 1 sociologist. A month later, they numbered 14. 2 years later, in 1935, there were 18 professors. In 1941, 31, and as many lecturers and research assistants. And that, of course, was not all. By the time the war ended, let me repeat, Johnson had provided visas and jobs for nearly 200 refugee scholars and artists, most of them on temporary 2-year contracts, to teach at the New School's continuing education program and in its francophone, École Libre des Hautes Études. Although Johnson welcomed as many exiled professors and artists as he could to different programs within the New School, his top priority remained the university in exile, a model he had hoped other academic leaders would adopt. American universities, he insisted, whenever he had the chance, in letters to colleagues and in articles in the New York Times, had to do more than save the lives of exiled professors, as important as that was. They had to rescue as well the institution that gave rise to German scholarship, to which American academic life was deeply indebted. Like other American intellectuals of his generation, Johnson considered the German university system far superior to the American. He received his PhD in economics from Columbia University in 1902, only 22 years after New York's oldest academic institution, originally founded in 1754, had become a research university on the German model. Then in 1927, he became the associate editor of the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences and began reading the work of European social scientists systematically, an experience that only deepened his respect for German scholarship. So, did Johnson succeed? Not in the eyes of the wider academic community, and I add to institutions the mainstream academic community, not necessarily one institution as I proceed with this paper. And if you have to cut me, you cut me. I think I'm keeping to time, but yes. Please keep. During the 1930s and 40s, the few others who were also trying to rescue refugee scholars from Europe vehemently objected to what Johnson was doing. They urged the New School to abandon its university in exile and work exclusively with them through the Institute of International Education and the Rockefeller Foundation. Dismissing Johnson's intellectual project, they wanted to absorb the talent fleeing Europe into universities across the country, with the goal of having these foreign scholars blend into already existing academic departments. Johnson refused. Although he agreed to help with the wider project and did so heroically, he continued to defend his idea of creating a separate faculty of European scholars at the New School. But what Johnson had in mind was not entirely clear. While he had great respect for the theoretical and historical breadth of European scholarship, he gravitated toward social scientists who applied their deep learning to active engagement in government and policy research. Most of Johnson's good friends at the University in Exile, renamed the Graduate Faculty of Political and Social Science in 1934, had previously held government positions in Imperial Weimar Germany and/or had worked in research institutes. They also had a great deal of experience as journalists and as editors of academic publications. While teaching at the New School, these refugee scholars became consultants for the U.S. government through the Institute of World Affairs, IWA, a policy center Johnson created and staffed with his exiled professors. The IWA was co-directed by two economists, Adolf Loh, who had run the Kiel Institute in Germany, and Hans Staudinger, who had served as the undersecretary in the Prussian Ministry of Commerce during the Weimar Republic, and as an elected representative of the Social Democratic Party in the Reichstag. In a letter to a donor in January 1944, Johnson reported, "We have developed into an institution so well manned, so well equipped for handling problems of world affairs, that every week Washington appeals to us to make a report on German railways, on various economic problems in North Africa or southern Italy, on the ways in which Russia has developed industrial management, etc." 1 year earlier, in 1943, the New School had published a fundraising brochure in which Johnson listed 23 agencies of the U.S. government, quote, that had called upon the New School for reports. Other members of the faculty took leaves of absence to work for the Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower administrations, some of whom never returned to the full-time faculty. In 1937, the New School's journal, Social Research, marked the 4th anniversary of the university in exile with a special issue that included articles by Hans Speyer and Harold Laswell on the social conditions and the intellectual influence of the refugee scholars, not just at the New School, but across the United States. These articles were among the earliest on these subjects and did not predictably venture beyond generalities. It would take another 30 years before members of the American academic community would begin producing comprehensive studies of the generation of émigré scholars. In 1969, Donald Fleming and Bernard Bailyn published an ambitious edited volume, The Intellectual Migration, Europe and America, 1930 to 1960, which included 14 extended essays, followed by an annotated list of 300 notable émigrés. In their introduction, the two Harvard professors wrote, "We believe that the New School for Social Research deserves a study in itself as a major organ for effecting the relocation of some of the most influential refugees." A couple of the essays acknowledged as well the importance of the New School, including one by Peter Gay on Weimar culture, which quoted Arnold Brecht, the New School's political scientist. But only one article looked seriously at the scholarship of any member of the graduate faculty, the essay on experimental psychology, which featured the work of Max Wertheimer. On the list of 300 notable émigrés, Fleming and Bailyn included 17 who had come to the New School between 1933 and 1945, only 6 of whom, however, held professorial positions at the graduate faculty. Brecht was not among them. The others were affiliated with continuing education and the École Libre. Of the 6 who had taught at the graduate faculty, only 2 stayed at the New School for most of their active academic careers in the United States, and one of those, Max Wertheimer, died in 1943. The other, Hans Simons, left after 25 years for the Ford Foundation. As for the other 4 who appeared on the list of 300, Jakob Marschak and Leo Strauss left for the University of Chicago, Hans Speyer for the Rand Institute after spending the war years in Washington, and Max Ascoli to work in journalism full-time as the managing editor of The Reporter. All of them resigned in the 1940s. Finally, Hannah Arendt also appeared on the list of 300, but she only came to the graduate faculty in 1967. When scholars heeded Fleming and Bailyn's advice and paid closer attention to the history of the New School, their studies did little to challenge what the Harvard professors had implied. For the most part, they concurred. The refugee scholars who had remained at the graduate faculty had little impact on the wider academic community. Ditto for most of those who left to do policy research. In 1984, the sociologist Louis Kozar tried to explain why. The New School's refugee scholars, Kozar wrote, were parochial in their orientations. Isolating themselves with like-minded peers and students, they developed only a limited capacity to deal with native-born scholars who had different vantage points. Although they had decided to remain in the United States, they looked, quote, more like birds than plants, he wrote, borrowing the image from Mary McCarthy, quote, perching wherever they were, ready for homeward flight. Johnson's birds, Kozar continued, thought of themselves as exiles rather than immigrants, and this continued to be the case even after they acquired American citizenship. For example, Arnold Brecht with his wife Clara, who had never moved out of a residential hotel. They kept their luggage, Kozar added, hammering in his point, figuratively, if not literally, always packed.
Judith?
Although, 3 minutes? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm close. I'm almost there.
Very
All
good.
right.
Very good.
Although Kozar did not mention it, other members of the graduate faculty moved to Riverdale, adopting comfortably to American suburban life, living near one another, it is true, but hardly perched for homeward flight. Kozar did not concede that several members had become less parochial. Kozar did concede that several members had become less parochial over time. But as they ventured out, they stopped publishing in social research and eventually left for other academic institutions. Generalizations like these obscure more than they reveal, something Klaus-Dieter Krohn observed in Intellectuals in Exile, which appeared 3 years after Kozar's book. Although Krohn took his distance from much of what Kozar had to say, he agreed that Brecht had remained a marginal member of the academic community, even among his fellow émigré scholars at the New School, a position I challenge in my forthcoming article in Social Research, but do not have time to address today. How about the others, members of the émigré faculty who arrived between 1933 and 45? 6 of them died before the war ended. Another 5 moved on to other institutions by the end of the 1940s. Among them, Gerhard Colm, who continued to work for the U.S. government throughout the 1950s, during which time he was credited with having played an important role in shaping American and post-war German fiscal policy. None of this, apparently, was of any interest to the authors of The Intellectual Migration, even though Colm had a major reputation among economists. On April 16, 1933, just 12 days after Colm had lost his position at the Kiel Institute, the distinguished émigré economist Joseph Schumpeter circulated his name along with those of 7 other outstanding German economists and 1 sociologist, explaining that they were all the victims of Hitler's ardors. Schumpeter had left Germany in 1932 to accept a job at Harvard. In addition to wanting to help his former colleagues for humanitarian reasons, he recommended them, he said, because he believed that they would make outstanding contributions to science. Of the 8 economists on the list, Johnson ended up hiring 5 of them. If we try to generalize about, I'm going to quit here. Let me just add there are others that I could talk about. In philosophy, Alfred Schutz is very important to the story as well. Let me just then conclude. With few exceptions, the literature on émigré scholars and artists who came to the United States during Hitler's years has focused too little on the contributions of to the wider academic community and policy communities. It has focused too little on these members. Following the lead of Klaus, I'm sorry, I cut too much. Please forgive me. There were others who were also engaged. But Johnson, let us not forget, wanted the graduate faculties to stand apart. He had opened the University in Exile to rescue the European university tradition from the claws of barbarism and to give Americans the opportunity to learn new ways of analyzing social, economic, and political behavior. Quote, "The methods they employed were obviously continental. The material was of the world at large. Forced into exile, these scholars came to their subjects," he noted proudly, "with a burning sense of purpose that few Americans at the time understood. From the moment they arrived, they devoted their days and nights to the deepest and most painful study of the forces that make weal or woe in our modern world." To conclude, with few exceptions, the literature on émigré scholars and artists who came to the United States during the Hitler years has focused too little on the contributions to the wider academic and policy communities of long-standing members of the graduate faculty. Following the lead of Klaus-Dieter Krohn and Peter Rutkoff and William Scott, whose composite portraits of these exiled intellectuals have paved the way, new work is beginning to appear in English on individual scholars, much of it by social scientists who are contributing to the forthcoming winter issue of Social Research. This new work is complicating the story in interesting ways at a time when the boundaries between scholarly and applied research are breaking down and the roles of intellectuals within and beyond the university are blurring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Friedlander for this wonderful opening presentation, which presented us the really fascinating history of these institutions, and we can really tell that institutions matter. But now we have to jump a little bit and come now to Ludger Pries's presentation about exile dynamics and impacts of European social scientists since the 1930s.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to talk, to have a conference, to give a paper on this conference. Special thanks to the Leo Baeck Institute, to the New School and Bill, and to the DFG that financed this. Jeremy Ailman yesterday mentioned that it's only 1% academics out of 70 million refugees worldwide. And Judith, I think, was quite right to underline that this 1% has much more effects, and there's a certain leverage effect of the importance of these intellectuals who came to the United States, but also to other countries. So I was working, I'm specialized in sociology of migration, and then had the privilege to work for 2 years in the Colegio de Mexico in the Wilhelm and Alexander von Humboldt chair. And so as I knew the history of the New School for Social Research, I thought it's necessary to make a comparison between these two institutions, because both institutions were built up by refugees, and there's a special mixture of instrumentalism and charity, etc., which I will come to speak about right now. So for me, it's a pleasure to be here and to go on with this research. We held a conference in Mexico in October last year, and we are preparing a book on this, which hopefully will come out next year. So I will speak about 3 topics briefly. First of all, what do we understand, or what do we mean when we speak about scholars as forced migrants, or scholars as emigrates or exiled persons, etc. This is a kind of introduction, and then I would like to compare the New School and the Colegio de Mexico, Colmex in abbreviation, and conclude some lessons to be learned. The first point, scholars as forced migrants. During the 1930s, there's a lot of, the title of this conference, Knowledge in Flight, Multidisciplinary Perspective on Scholar Rescue in North America, is very nice, I think, because it evades to define exactly what is an emigrant, what is an exiled person, etc., what is a refugee, etc. Because how to name scholars in flight or in rescue is quite a complicated thing. When I did interviews in Colmex, there were some Chilean colleagues of mine who said, no, I'm not a refugee, although they had to flee from the Pinochet regime. So anybody has quite different understandings, meanings on these terms. First, what is scholars as compared to intellectuals, scientists, activists, journalists, writers, or politically active persons working for governments, etc.? What about the term refugees that actually are escaping from death, or exiled persons as being involuntarily excluded by a government like the German Nazi regime? Many of the people we are speaking about do not consider themselves exclusively as refugees, like even Albert Hirschman did not consider himself only as a refugee, but also as an activist. So it's quite difficult to... Schumpeter already was here when, with a fellowship when Nazi regime began in 1933. So it's quite difficult. Emigrés, the French term, I think is too low for what happened with the Nazi regime. When the Nazi regime began with the Shoah genocide, it's difficult to only characterize this as emigrates, those who had to flee. So, and also the point between birds and plants, what you mentioned right now. Migrants want to assimilate to the country they are arriving at. They are emigrants from their country of origin and immigrants in the country of arrival, or they are suffering and trying to return suffering as diaspora migrants, for instance. So there's a huge range of different concepts. And my point, or my proposal would be, as a sociologist of migration, to understand all these groups with the term forced migrants, but because in a certain extent they are forced to leave their country. And this is a neutral and open term that could include a lot of what I mentioned before. And I understand migration as an iterative, open-ended, plurilocal, pluridirectional process of negotiated participation in social and societal affairs. This is a mechanism of self-ascription and of ascription by others. And this is all the complexity of what are emigrates, refugees, etc., etc. I think even for the historical study of persons, we could learn from this, let's say, modern concept of migration, which is different from what we had in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, as assimilation or integration were the main concepts. For me, also transnationalism research, where I'm working for about 25 years now, with migration studies in Mexico and other countries, transnationalism research is good for let's say, saving us from a methodological nationalism to only have a closer look at Germany and the United States, but to have a closer look at the transnational networks people are moving in. And to admit that life is possible not only as an either-or relation, either being immigrant or being a return migrant, but that there also is possible a life as a transnational, plurilocal, national, transnational social spaces. To a certain extent, from my point of view, Hannah Arendt and also Stern, for instance, were transnational travelers, at least since the 1950s, 60s. They participated actively in the public discourses in Germany and other European countries, as well as in the United States. So this is my general reflection and consideration. So we have a lot of studies on the preconditions, forms and context, the consequences and impact of fleeing, of arrival, and of possible return of individuals or specific groups. What, from my point of view, is needed, or what would be important, is comparative studies of regions, of periods, and also of the organizations and institutions involved in this. This is a point Jeremy made yesterday evening, and you mentioned it this morning again. And also I think it is important to reconsider theoretical framing of our studies. Well, let's come briefly to the two examples of the New School and Colmex. The New School already was mentioned in 1919, founded as a new model of higher education for adults, leaning on Germany's Volkshochschulen by critical scientists. Alvin Johnson then founded the University in Exile, sponsoring some 180 scholars and their families persecuted by the Nazi regime as Jews or socialists, communists. A lot of financial sources of financial support. In nowadays, if I'm not wrong, it's about 75 full-time professors, some 800 graduate students at the New School. So the New School would not exist without the high input of the refugees during the since 1933. The Colegio de México was founded in 1938 as Casa de España, based on direct permit of the Mexican president Lázaro Cárdenas. And I think you will speak, Daniela, you will speak much more about it. I only will mention it very briefly. It was founded then as El Colegio de México in 1940. Alfonso Reyes was his first president during almost 20 years. And during the 1970s, it was a safe harbor for forced migrants, mainly from Latin America. A very important point. It's not just receiving people at one moment in time, but then have a trajectory of rescue of scholars during decades afterwards. And it now hosts 7 study centers, some 180 full-time professors, some 450 students. It's the most privileged situation all over the world. I know the relation professors and students, much more than the new school. All the students, this is important, have a public fellowship. It's a completely meritocratic system. It's not the haves and the not-haves, but only the haves in the sense of intellectual capabilities. The general culture is a cosmopolitan, republican organizational culture combining societal responsibility with commitment and scientific rigor. I think this is a very specific combination in the Colmex. We can learn a lot of this. And actually, the Colmex was founded by the refugees. It would not exist without the refugees, the same as the New School. Now, let me briefly sketch out some of the very important aspects if we compare both institutions. First, the general climate in the country of arrival, where the refugees came and arrived. In the US, we have the Roosevelt's New Deal since March 33, so the need to import or to develop knowledge on economic planning, etc., etc. And we have a certain climate of welcoming of Keynesian New Dealers, but also certain anti-Semitism, which was mentioned yesterday, and I think we will speak about it perhaps afterwards. But here in New York City, we had a general cosmopolitan climate and history. This is different to Mexico City at that moment. In Mexico, we have a consolidation of the Mexican Revolution and higher education. We have a central leftist and nationalist government. Remember the nationalization of railways and oil companies in 1938, and the need of a general nationalist discourse to establish and to strengthen the governmental and state structures after the revolution. This was the situation of a general anti-immigration law and culture, and also a certain anti-Semitism. You will speak about it, and much more expert than me. What about the higher education system? In the United States, we have a highly established system with a mix of renowned private and some public universities. The private universities were almost rejecting Jewish people at that moment in 1933. And in Mexico, we have an education system in the making and in consolidation only since the 1920s, after the revolution that ended formally in 1917. And we have a notion of a perceived low quality, where the import of fresh intellectuals from abroad could help to develop and strengthen the educational system. So the institutional setting, on the one hand side, we had concerning funding, etc., mobilizing resources. On the one hand, in the United States, we have private organizations like Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations, the Oberländer Trust, and philanthropists who gave a lot of money, met a lot of money, but the government, the federal government, was out of this. Contrary to this, in Mexico, we had direct access of cosmopolitan Mexican intellectuals to governmental decision makers via personal networks. And the government was a central actor in this. Finally, we had two different windows of opportunities in both cases. On the one hand, there was no established group opposed to recruitment of refugees. Raising money for a dozen of refugees from April to October 33 was not easy, but there was no resistance against it because there was just a handful of full-time academics at the new school at that moment. On the contrary, in Mexico, we had diplomats and intellectuals with access to the government and educational reforms since mid of the 1930s, and an ambiguous situation at UNAM because there was also a discussion to recruit refugees to the UNAM and not found a new and separate institution as the Colmex was then. Okay. The very crucial role is that of cosmopolitan leaders. Judith already mentioned Alvin Johnson. I think it's not necessary to add anything. But in the case of Mexico, of the Colmex, we had at least two very cosmopolitan leaders. And the underlining is on cosmopolitan. Alvin Johnson, by co-editing the encyclopedia, was able to travel all over Europe. He knew all European scholars and intellectuals in social sciences. The same for Daniel Cosío Villegas and for Alfonso Reyes. I could not go into deeper details. But there was, both were very cosmopolitan in their orientations, knew a lot of people all over the world. It was not a binational relation between Mexico, Spain, but it was a transnational, it was a global relation or network. The institutional goals and effects were, in the case of the new school, strengthening and upgrading of a well-situated academic organization academically and internationally. This is without any doubt. And in the case of Mexico, funding a new academic organization, strengthening the national higher education and opening a national popular perspective. Last point, the forced migrants addressed and invited to come to Mexico came, in the case of the United States, from Germany, Austria, France, Italy, and Belgium, in the case of the new school. In the case of Mexico, exclusively Spaniards. This is an interesting point. And there was a specific combination of a nationalist populism in Mexico, and at the same time, it was the ex-colonial power from which people were invited to come to Mexico. So it's a very interesting combination of groups coming. Let's come to the lessons and conclusions. First of all, I think it's very important to underline what has been a catastrophe and a bane for some was a boon and an opportunity for others. Between charity and instrumental utilitarianism at the individual and at the organizational level, there's always a mixture, and we have to consider this until today. Second, there was a combination of cosmopolitan transnational leaders and of windows of opportunity, as I sketched it out. And here, two short quotes. Klaus-Dieter Krohn writes, in fact, Johnson's failure to sustain a permanent faculty at the new school after 22 may have worked to the refugees' advantage. At the new school, no established group opposed their recruitment, nor were they under any compulsion to blend or to become Americanized. And concerning the arguments to be presented with the Mexican president, Daniel Cosío Villegas said, we would have a characteristic, if we accept these Spaniards, we would have a characteristic that would provoke sympathy all over the world for us. In the same way as it did for various foreign universities when having received the wise Germans men expulsed by the Hitlerism. This was New School, learning from the New School example. At the same time, we would acquire 10 men of the first line who would help us raise the level of our culture that has fallen so many years ago. So it was a mix of charity and utilitarianism, and I think this is legitimate. And we have to accept it and to analyze it. And this leads me to my third conclusion. Knowledge in flight and dealing with scholars as forced migrants is a collective and historical learning process. This is well known from the German case and the Spanish Spanish case, but leads me up to the situation right now. Fourth, the forced migrants' trajectories are iterative, open-ended, plurilocal, pluridirectional process of self-ascription and ascription by others. It's a negotiation process, and it makes no sense, from my point of view, to distinguish between birds and plants or criticize some for being birds and others for being plants. Fifth, we need more studies comparing regions, groups, organizations, and periods framed by theoretical concepts. And this leads me to my last point. There should be some bridges between the science, the scientific analysis, and the practical coping with current challenges and needs, and thereby a little bit commenting what Jeremy mentioned yesterday. Power relations always are in play. It's not possible to speak about an equal power between Princeton University and Jordan refugee camp. So we have to be very sensitive on this aspect of power relations, but we have to engage in solidarity and practical help. And this is just some of the arguments I think today in the afternoon will be presented. The forced migration challenges we face now in Europe and the recent initiatives between Middle East and Europe, and here we have a lot of different programs. I will not have time to comment on this, but one interesting citation I would like to end up with. Due to the refugee movement from Near and Middle East, Africa and Asia, Europe became the main region of arrival of scientists seeking refuge. The top 5 countries of origin of individuals supported by the Scholars at Risk network, in total 192 in 2016, were Syria, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Ethiopia. And the 5 main target countries of internationally displaced researchers were Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, Norway, and Sweden. So we have, if we speak about Mexico and the US and the New School and Colmex, we also have to take into account this situation is shifting crucially towards Europe during the last decade, and we should learn a lot from what other colleagues will present right now on the cases of the New School and Mexico. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pries. This was the ideal bridge, I think, between the 2 topics or the 3 presentations, and we will now dive into the Mexican context, and I have the pleasure to present to you my colleague Daniela Gleiser, who now has the word.
So, hello everyone. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to share the results of my research with you. And I hope my Mexican accent will be clear enough. So my paper, the title of my paper is International Rescue of Academics, Intellectuals and Artists from Nazism During the Second World War, the Experience of Mexico. And this paper aims to analyze the experience of Mexico in relation to the rescue of anti-fascist refugees during the Second World War, since this case is useful to reflect on the importance which transnational cooperation had on the rescue of people and the necessity of involving local groups who understood domestic forms of negotiation and cultural codes. The Mexican case is also an opportunity to raise important questions over the criteria used for the selection of refugees, since priority was given to political over academic refugees. So I divided my paper in 2 parts, and I will start with part 1. In July 1938, while the first international conference on the refugees from Nazism was underway in Evian, France, the Mexican president, Lázaro Cárdenas, granted an interview to the reporter and intellectual Anita Brenner, in which he announced his invitation to technicians, scholars, and scientists from Germany, Austria, and Spain to settle in Mexico, reporting that the first 21 were already underway. Not only did he guarantee permanent residence, but the president also promised to grant them rapid citizenship, since many of the positions they would occupy required it under Mexican law. And he declared, "We want them so much that we are now taking measures to open our immigration's door wide to them." The first German and Austrian refugees from the Rhineland and Austria arrived in August, but they were neither scholars nor scientists. They were Jewish refugees who had arrived in Mexico on tourist visas. There was only one technician, Mr. Muntz, who was an aircraft mechanic. The majority were traders or tradespeople. They were not invited to stay in the country, much less were they offered citizenship. In fact, it was very complicated to procure for them a change of immigration status, from tourist to that of exile, which was in any case a status that precluded permission to work. Therefore, they had to be maintained by the local Jewish community. From then on, the policy towards Jewish refugees very quickly became more restrictive. It must be borne in mind that Jewish immigration was prohibited in the country from 1934, on the grounds that Jews comprised elements that could not be assimilated into Mexican mestizaje, the mix, which refers to mixed race of the Mexican people, and were therefore defined as undesirable. From these first contacts with the refugee crisis from Nazism, the Mexican authorities had to draw up a clear position in the area. Just in many other countries, a clear distinction was drawn between Jewish refugees, who were referred to as racial refugees, and valuable people who were worthy of rescue. According to the Minister of the Interior, so long as there were no consensus on international obligations, the country would only receive persecuted immigrants when these were, quote, prominent fighters for social progress, valiant defenders of republican institutions, or select exponents of science or the arts. Therefore, although the possibilities offered by Mexico to Jewish refugees were highly limited, the options for political exiles and members of the anti-Nazi and anti-fascist artistic or cultural elites appeared much greater. However, Mexico, like the other countries of Latin America, only became an attractive option, an attractive destination for intellectual and academic refugees later on, when hopes of reaching the United States had receded. Thus, when the Mexican government agreed to grant a few visas to German-speaking intellectuals in 1940 to 1942, there was a sense in which the most valuable people had already been saved, and that those who were left were the leftovers. In summarizing the policy toward German-speaking exiles, I should mention three of the features which distinguish the Mexican case from other experiences of asylum during the period. The first was the originality of the Mexican government in placing a value on the political dimension of the anti-Nazi exile. The United States focused principally on the professional capacity of the exiles, and even created bodies with the purpose of rescuing European intellectuals, artists, and academics. Brazil took a more pragmatic stance, seeking to capture the availability of foreign capital and the technical and professional skills of certain refugees based on economic considerations. Mexico, on the other hand, agreed to give preferential asylum to political refugees. Hence, among the statements of the Mexican officials, we find many references to the need to save those who did something to defend democracy or to oppose totalitarianism based on the consideration that they deserved to be helped. Therefore, it was not enough for the refugees to have been members of trade unions or anti-Nazi youth groups. There was a search for people with more direct political commitment who were persecuted because of their commitment. The second characteristic was tolerance, and even a preference under certain circumstances for communists, who were banned in places like the United States or Brazil, and particularly Stalinist communists. during the Second World War, Mexico City was the second most important place for communist exile after Moscow, largely because of the support that the German communists had given to the Spanish Republic during the Civil War, and the decision by Mexico of granting entry visas to all who had fought in the international brigades. The fact that many of the fighters had assumed Spanish citizenship facilitated their arrival in Mexico, whose immigration policy was very open to Spaniards. In terms of foreign policy, accepting these refugees into the country meant, as in the Spanish case, supporting the anti-imperialist and anti-fascist position of the Mexican government displayed before the League of Nations with concrete actions. Mexico portrayed itself as a country with principles which were accompanied by coherent practices. It was not just a reaffirmation of national sovereignty in the face of European fascism, but also to the United States, a country that had denied these exiles asylum in its own territory. The third feature is linked precisely to the previous point, the fact that there was no policy for attracting talent. Frank Tenenbaum, who was Roosevelt's right-hand man and a good friend of Cárdenas, had put forward to Cárdenas the idea of setting up a university with scientists and academics who had fled Nazism, but the proposal was not accepted. It is possible that the lack of support of the Mexican intellectual and academic groups themselves was one of the explanations for this. For example, the first to oppose the arrival of foreign doctors were Mexican doctors. They did not want any competition. Various US bodies, above all, tried to convince President Cárdenas of the advantages of receiving Jewish scientists, but in this case there was, on the one hand, a strong tension between the opportunity to save lives and the interest of Mexican academia, and on the other, the consideration of not receiving those who were thought not susceptible of assimilation into Mexican mestizaje because of their religious affiliations or ethnicity, at a time when the Mexican government was proposing to work towards greater homogeneity. Another proposal by Luis Montes de Oca, the former director of the Bank of Mexico, envisaged the creation of an international institute of social sciences under the direction of Ludwig von Mises, with potential participation of several Austrian economists exiled in New York but without US citizenship, but he did not receive any financial backing for the project. Nevertheless, Cárdenas did support the steps, as Ludger said, the steps taken by Daniel Cosío Villegas to invite a handful of top-flight Spanish scientists, writers, and artists with exemplary moral qualities who would arrive in 1938 and would form the Casa de España in Mexico, the forerunner of El Colegio de México, one of the country's most important institutions for research and teaching in social sciences. And I must say, more than UNAM. The fact that this was the sole educational project to go ahead was no accident. The Mexican position on Spanish exiles was much more generous than it was on Central European exiles. In addition to political empathy with the Republican side, there was the consideration that the Spaniards could be better assimilated into Mexican population and culture. So now I will turn to part number 2. I would like now to turn to one of the key issues for the rescue process. Despite the fact that this topic is tackled from national perspectives in historiography, such as what Mexico or the United States did to save refugees, an analysis of the Mexican case brings to light the importance of transnational support networks for the rescue of refugees, networks consisting of both governmental and non-governmental bodies, and the importance of local groups in the negotiation with the government for the authorization of visas. An analysis of the project set up in order to bring exiles from Nazism to Mexico reveals that the efforts made by various US groups which were not working with local support groups emphatically failed. Doubtless, they met with serious obstacles put in place by the government, but they did not know how to bypass them because they were not familiar with the local cultural codes nor with Mexican forms of negotiation. Basically, they did not understand the rules of the corruption game or were not prepared to play the game. Although there were precedents for cooperation between Mexican and foreign bodies, such as the Leon Trotsky asylum case, cooperation became more intensive after the French defeat of June 1940, and with the need to find visas for tens of thousands of refugees packed into Vichy France, many of whom were actively sought by the Gestapo. Because of the slow and complex process of obtaining US visas and even the so-called emergency visas, and the impossibility for communists or individuals linked to leftist organizations to obtain them, Mexico began to emerge as an increasingly attractive option. After this point, organizations in the United States, such as the League of American Writers, the Joint Anti-Fascist Refugee Committee, and the Jewish Labor Committee, entered into contact with groups set up in Mexico by exiles Germans who arrived previously, with representatives of the local Jewish community and with personalities from the Mexican anti-fascist left, such as Vicente Lombardo Toledano. The cooperation of these groups was vital to ensure that President Cárdenas authorized visas for an initial list of German-speaking political and intellectual refugees of no more than 20 individuals, among them including Alfred Döblin, Anna Segers, Franz Berefeld, Rudolf Leonard, etc. At the time of approving their entry request, the president declared, quote, "This is about people who, because of their background, represent the tradition of German culture, and to their personal qualities must be added that of being campaigners for justice. Therefore, their presence in the country should be greeted with genuine sympathy." 2 days before leaving office in 1940, Cárdenas also authorized the entry of 90 German and Austrian intellectual and political refugees. Despite the genuine sympathy that President Cárdenas referred to, the refugees were met with enormous bureaucratic obstacles on the part of the French and the Mexican authorities. The obstacles they faced in France are well known, such as the impossibility of obtaining exit and transit visas and the fact that they were stateless individuals and hence did not have valid passports. The focus here will therefore be on the obstacles placed by the Mexican authorities. The principal problem was that the government of Manuel Ávila Camacho, who ran from 1940 to 1946, did not feel obliged to respect the permits approved by President Cárdenas. It must be said that the problem was an inherited one, as little had been done to open the doors of the country while the latter was still in power, although a few personalities had arrived during his term in office. To be fair, the situation had become a great deal more complex after 1940, and many who were authorized to enter Mexico could not do so until 1941 or 42. Once Cárdenas' presidency was over, the renewal of expired visas was very complicated, and the intervention of local groups was critical for the follow-up of cases and to maintain pressure on the government. According to Heidi Stockbaum, of the list of 20 individuals initially authorized by Cárdenas, only Anna Segers and Andreas Ebert entered Mexico with their families. Some of their partners had been imprisoned by the Gestapo, while others had obtained visas for the United States. From the second group of 19 people, the League of German Culture reported in October 1941 that only a few communists who feature in the lists had received their visas, but none the non-communist anti-fascists. Only like 6 people received their papers in the consulate in Marseille. So, transnational cooperation became even more necessary in 1940 and 1941 years of tremendous urgency for the rescue of refugees. From mid-1941, it became practically impossible to obtain US visas, which is why support agencies concentrated on searching for visas for refugees to other countries in the world, principally in Latin America. To do this, it was vital to have the support of local groups. The Society of Culture and Aid, SCA, was one of the most important support groups, other than the League for German Culture. It was formed by a small group of Jewish Bundists who had arrived in Mexico a few years before, working in partnership with the Jewish Labor Committee, GLC, and also the Emergency Rescue Committee, and negotiating entry permits in Mexico City. In the years 1941 to 1942, the modus operandi for rescue changed. It was no longer to seek presidential permits, but to negotiate directly for visas with the Ministry of the Interior. Various archival sources confirmed that they had to pay out $500 per person, and that was a bribe, it was not the cost. To do this, they not only required local negotiators, but a contact working within the ministry. Once the visas were approved, the JLC would send the money to Mexico to make payments, and the telegrams with the names of the fortunate individuals were sent to the Mexican consuls, principally the Mexican consul in Marseille, so that they could be given their visas on the spot. The correspondence between the SCA and the GLC is extremely interesting, but we don't have time to go into a deeper analysis. This was, however, only the start of the process, not the end. Once the visas were approved, an endless series of bureaucratic obstacles had to be overcome, some of which appeared perfectly designed to prevent the entry of the exiles, such as, for example, the requisite to have re-entry permits to France. Such permits were impossible to obtain. The Mexican Immigration Archive has an enormous quantity of applications by Central European refugees, many of whom were intellectuals and academics and were rejected. Since certain exiles were able to enter Mexico, it is still necessary to investigate the criteria for their selection. Because of the highly discretionary nature of the Mexican immigration policy, it is possible that there were no clear criteria. Instead, the small number of visas were approved on the basis of relationships between the Mexican authorities and the groups who applied for them, on the basis of political sympathies, mostly toward communists, and of course due to illegal arrangements. In conclusion, it is important to emphasize that the image of Mexico as a country with open doors, which generously received European refugees, only applies to Spanish Republican exiles. In all other cases, Mexico adopted a position that was passive. That is, it did not actively seek to attract valuable people, but it accepted the applications made to it to receive certain personalities with reluctance, without accepting them from the respective bureaucratic process, which in general was a serious hindrance to save refugees. The Mexican case is interesting because of the peculiarities which I noted at the start of my paper. The preference for political refugees, particularly communists, and the fact that in a country with so many needs and with a modernization project which had an important educational and cultural component, there was no active policy for attracting talent. One possible answer is that the country considered the issue of receiving anti-fascist exiles with its foreign policy in mind and not within the framework of its internal needs. The restrictive immigration policy of the period and the resistance of local intellectual groups to receive competition must also be taken into consideration. These groups were an important support of the Cardenista government. Even so, it is still necessary to provide a more accurate answer to this question. On the other hand, the Mexican case demonstrates the importance of involving local groups in the refugee rescue efforts and the need to adopt a different approach that includes these networks and not to analyze the issue of rescue solely from a national perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Why don't you Professor Priest and Friedlander come up front, and since we started 20 minutes late, I take the liberty to extend this session for 20 minutes for the question and answer period. And I guess what the papers have presented to us is a perfect fit here of three different dimensions, and also a theme that seems to be conspicuous by its absence or by having been mentioned only in passing, the theme of anti-Semitism here, you know, which might be a topic to be discussed, but of course the floor is open to you. Please, yeah.
I think one of the uniting themes came from Mr. Weitzer's...
Do we have a microphone perhaps, or
Yes,
could you
over there.
speak up?
Oh. No, that one, this one. Dahinter, steht doch da.
Ah, that one, yeah, of course.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So I was just listening, very informative presentations and trying to see if there was a common denominator that I could comment on. And it began with Mr. Weitzer's comment about the Supreme Court decision that he read in the New York Times. And my question is, do you think that the nation states should be selective, whether it was in history back in the time or today, in terms of who they accept into their country? In other words, the idea of a scholar being somehow to be totally respected and accepted for being a scholar. And in fact, we see this on the campuses in the United States today, where some scholars, where some scholars are some scholars are not accepted, the speakers, and there's violence, and we know the story. I don't know if this is happening in Europe, but in other words, if universities can make decisions as to who gets to speak politically on the campuses, wouldn't it also make sense for the United States not to accept people, scholars, who come in who have been convicted terrorists, or support of terrorism, who are supportive of ISIS, who are support of the things which are, as Dr. Friedlander said, things that are not about the life of democracy and civilization, but essentially the death of life and civilization as we know it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have to collect some questions, and the next one was right here in the back, but I'll be coming back to you too.
Perhaps Professor Friedlander can answer this one. Above and beyond the New School, a good number of those exiled scholars got positions in the archipelago of traditionally black colleges and universities. And many of them obviously were shocked about the level of prejudice here. But what was their impact, you know, overall, if you could speak to that?
There's also the issue of the existential reality for scholars of not falling into the Socrates pit where a society destroys its wisest man. In other words, the respect for excellence. There has to be a thread of that. I see it in the United States, more so perhaps than Mexico, because for 1923 on, we had elite educated presidents, Ivy League people, the Roosevelts certainly, Stanford, Amherst with Coolidge. So I have a feeling that even though there was some, you know, recidivists in that area, there was always that breadth, that idea, and Johnson certainly had it. You can't allow the best and the brightest to perish. That's a great Socrates sin.
Thank you. Now I have two more questions on the list, and because we're running a little short of time, we will collect them all together here and have one round of
I'll be really quick. I just wanted to ask the colleagues who talked about Mexico. Can you give us just a brief idea of what it was like elsewhere in Latin America? Is Mexico the exception to the rule for Latin America?
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful first panel. And my question goes to Ludger and to Judith. It's about the outsiders and the cosmopolitans, because I think they are closely connected. Because the outsiders and the cosmopolitans, I think they are closely connected because both are some like the outstanding, the not normal personal. And I was thinking if we not can integrate them, so my impression is the New School scholars weren't outsiders at all, otherwise they wouldn't have transformed the institution as such so tremendously and wouldn't have had such an intellectual impact, so they were very at the core and not at the outside. And second, the cosmopolitan leaders, as you sketched them, they were very much integrated in transnational research as it had developed before 1933. And this, I mean, you mentioned the encyclopedia. This were really normal, like say, coming out of everyday research practices, projects that came out of everyday research practices. And I was wondering if we not can, well, try to get rid of this exceptional language and just try to have a look on the transnational dimension of research and collaboration before 1933 and take this as a starting point to analyze what happened then. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you for the stimulating questions. And now we come to the responses, and perhaps we start with Judith Friedlander.
All right, I'll try. I'll try to do so. Let me just first mention the matter of the black colleges. This is incredibly important. I'm sorry, I really haven't done the proper research on this. I mean, I am bringing out a new book on the New School, history of the New School, and I mentioned this, but I have not really dug into those colleges. But many of the people, I repeat, that most of the people who came to the New School in the beginning were on 2-year contracts. And what to do with them afterwards? I mean, their visas really did require them to have other jobs. And these what we now call historically black colleges, reached out. And there's a wonderful documentary that describes the impact of this. I wish I had the title with me, but you can Google it. So of what happened and the impact these refugees had on these colleges and vice versa. It was a very important piece of the history. Thank you for mentioning it. I want to make one correction in terms of the welcoming at the New School, which I think overlaps with, you know, who gets to speak, who doesn't get to speak, who gets invited, who doesn't. The New School, the graduate faculty, as early as 1935, made it very clear that no fascist or communists were welcome. So the New School was not open to communists. That must be very clearly understood, though Alvin Johnson had a very interesting way of interpreting what that meant. So it was a very talented, he was giving visas, though he didn't come to Bertolt Brecht. He was very happy to have Hans Eisler work here as well. Piscator, Erwin Piscator, who founded the Actors Studio at the New School, was he a communist, was he not? I mean, they certainly was involved, had been in the Soviet Union in the 30s. These men were very involved with the Communist Party, and Johnson somehow didn't see them as a threat, and he went on in great lengths about why these people were not threats. Yet, the charter of the graduate faculty, which became the charter of the New School, said point blank that these people could not come because they did not believe in letting knowledge follow itself to its logical conclusion.
You label somebody a communist or you label somebody a fascist, you can either include them or exclude them depending on who you cover by that.
Well, that's exactly, which gets back to the other question that I thought perhaps I could respond to very quickly, was the outsider and the cosmopolitan. First of all, it depends on who's defining. But there is no question, the Germans, Kozar, a great sociologist, who was himself from an immigrant background, was excluding the New School crowd because he saw them as birds, as birds and not as plants. They didn't think of themselves as immigrants. They were still thinking about the transnational, if you will, and by mainstream academic America, they were outsiders, funnily enough, even though they were mainstream German scholars, they would never have been found if Johnson hadn't already knew who these people were. And if Schumpeter wasn't, in fact, it's the same list. I mean, everybody was talking about the same people, insiders, no question about it, but expelled from Germany, no? Expelled from Germany, so they were outsiders at that particular moment. So that's a very interesting question. I think I've talked enough.
So let me kind of give the word to Daniela now, and then finally to Ludger Pries. Daniela, would you want to?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, Mexico was in a sense an exception, and in a sense it was not. All the countries in Latin America had restrictions for the entry of refugees, especially Jewish refugees, but some of the countries made exceptions or took a more pragmatic policy, like Brazil that I mentioned, and Argentina also. In total, like 100,000 refugees came to Latin America during Nazism, and the country that received the largest number of refugees was Argentina, like more or less 25,000, 30,000, and one of the countries that received the smallest number was Mexico. Mexico only received less than 2,000 refugees, including the German-speaking exile. So, but Mexico was an exception in two ways. One, I said that it accepted the communists. It was a very important place for the refugee of communists. And the other one, that they developed a very important cultural activity as exiled German-speaking writers, and they published a lot. It was one of the main sites where they could continue publishing and writing. So I hope it's...
So we come to Ludger Pries.
Okay, thank you very much for the comments and questions. I have 3 points. First, as I mentioned, I think there is always this mixture of respecting norms of international human law and human rights, etc. Charity on the one hand side and utilitarianism or instrumentalism on the other side. We cannot neglect this, I think, but it would be very dangerous to go to one extreme in the sense of a nationalist and of a fully assimilationalist approach to these topics, as we saw it, and you mentioned Mexico in this quite exclusive way of receiving some Spaniards, but not people from other countries. And well, we know where nationalism leads to when we take the German history. So I think this is an ambiguity, but we have to define where we should draw the red line, what should not be permitted. And until today, we have this ambiguity of self-interest of some nations. In Germany, we have this argument of demographic challenges, etc., which is quite important in all the migration discourse. Second point, outsiders, cosmopolitans, etc. I think people always are, on the one hand side, rooted in some specific locales, places, etc., being it one place or many places. And on the other hand, they have contacts that go far beyond national, regional, etc. borders. And so we have to accept that people are, in the sense of Georg Simmel, maintaining social circles at very different levels. And we just, I think, have to offer them the opportunity to participate wherever they want in the place they are living in, to participate with their capacities in the social, the political, the cultural, and the economic life. Offering opportunities to participate is much more important, from my point of view, of a modern integration concept of the 21st century than assimilation or ask for some adaptation to the local customs and practices, languages, etc., etc. The last point, just think that in 1945 in Germany there lived almost 67 million people. 40 million people had direct experiences of forced migration. 40 million out of 67 million had experiences of having been refugees, etc., forced internally displaced persons, etc., etc. So, but the big legend after World War II was Germany is not an immigration country. We never gave people the opportunity, from my point of view, to arrive culturally, mentally, etc., and to share their own experiences as forced migrants. But we obliged those Russlanddeutsche, the mainly coming from Russia, we obliged them to assimilate from one day to another, to forget their 100 years old culture and experiences, etc. So I think it's very difficult, and we have to simply accept that a country like Germany, a country like Mexico, a country like the US are so pluricultural, so plurinational, so complicated in their history of immigration, etc., that it makes no sense to draw border lines, strict rules of exclusion, etc. And there are some humanitarian rights that nowadays, in 2015 in Germany, we just were faced with a situation of 1 million people coming just in 1 year, fleeing from the Syrian war. So what's the national interest? This is not, for me, this would not be an adequate category to discuss this question.
Okay, those were wonderful last words, I think. Thank you very much, all three speakers, but Judith Friedlander wants to add a final comment.
Please, if I may, it's not quite off subject. I think it's on subject, but it would be a real crime in a conference dealing with Mexico and the New School, Colegio de Mexico and the New School, not to mention the fact that there is an Orozco mural at the New School, which in fact is quite controversial if you have not seen it, because one of the panels is the Russian Revolution, another one is the Mexican Revolution, and there's Gandhi on the other side. But it became a real source of controversy, needless to say, at the New School, and it survived. A few years later, remember, Rockefeller Center destroyed the Diego Rivera mural. Mm-hmm. So anyway, if anybody here hasn't seen that while you're at the New School, I think we should make sure they do.
Thank you very much, all of you, and also for participating in the discussion. So we'll have a short break before continuing with our wonderful presentation.
Thank you. And could we